I almost didn't post this. I've written and deleted this thing 4 times now, and every time I get to the end I close the laptop and go sit in my truck with the engine running for an hour. Not going anywhere. Just sitting. But I think I need to get it out, and r/no sleep is the only place where people won't immediately tell me I'm having a breakdown or that grief does strange things to a person. Maybe it does. I'm not ruling that out. I'm not ruling anything out anymore. My name is Mark Calloway. I'm 38 years old. I work remotely as a technical writer for a software company out of Portland, which means I can live pretty much wherever I want, and what I wanted, after the divorce was finalized in February, was to be somewhere quiet and green and far enough away from everything that the silence felt chosen rather than imposed. I found a rental property outside Elwood, Oregon, a small unincorporated community about 40 miles southeast of Eugene, through a listing that described it as a writer's retreat with full amenity access and 2 acres of privacy. That was accurate. It was a cedar-sided house on a gravel road that dead-ended at a fence line, surrounded by second-growth Douglas fir and red cedar, and the nearest neighbor was a woman named Patrice who ran a lavender farm a quarter-mile up the road and waved whenever she saw my truck. The nearest gas station was 11 miles away. Cell service was fine. The internet was better than I expected. The walls smelled like cedar and old wood smoke, and in the mornings the mist came off the hills in long slow sheets that made the whole world look like something that hadn't quite been finished yet. I moved in on March 3rd. By the end of the first week I had a routine. I'd get up around 6:30, make coffee in the French press I'd brought from the apartment in Portland, drink it on the back deck while the birds sorted themselves out in the trees, then work from 8 to noon, eat lunch, walk in the afternoon, work again from 3 to 6, and spend the evenings reading or watching something on my laptop. It sounds monastic. It was monastic. I liked it. After 2 years of a marriage that had become a sustained argument conducted in the passive voice, the quiet felt like cool water on a burn. The Blackwood Conservancy started about a mile from my back fence. It's a state-managed wilderness preserve of something like 12,000 acres, old growth mixed in with logged-over land that's been rewilding for 30 or 40 years. There are maintained trails near the main entrance on Route 58, but the section closest to me was the less visited Eastern Corridor, where the trails were narrower and the signage older and the parking area was just a gravel pull-off with a rusted pipe gate and a notice board whose plexiglass cover had gone opaque with UV damage. I started walking there on March 8th. I went every afternoon, usually for 90 minutes to 2 hours, usually the same loop, in on the Eastern Ridge Trail, down the switchbacks to the creek drainage, along the creek for maybe half a mile, then back up via a firebreak path that came out almost exactly where I'd started. I saw deer. I heard owls. Once I saw a black bear about 200 feet off the trail, working at something in a rotting stump, completely uninterested in me. I took a photo and texted it to my sister Dana in Boise, who texted back a string of alarmed emojis and said I needed to carry bear spray, and I ordered bear spray from Amazon the same afternoon. I want to be very precise about the timeline because I've gone over it so many times that I need the precision to stay sane. March 19th was a Tuesday. The weather had been dry for almost a week, which was unusual for that part of Oregon in March, and the trails were firm and mostly clear of the mud that had made them difficult in the first 2 weeks. I went out around 2:15 in the afternoon. The air smelled like wet pine and something faintly sweet that I could never identify, some flower or fungus or combination thereof. I was maybe 45 minutes into the walk, just past the third switchback where the trail widens out before the creek descent, when I saw it. It was sitting just off the left edge of the trail, in the leaf litter at the base of a vine maple, perfectly upright as though it had been placed there. A child's sneaker. Left foot. Blue, with a white sole and a Velcro strap instead of laces. Stride Right brand, I could read the logo on the side clearly. Size, from the look of it, maybe a 7 or an 8. Toddler. Maybe 2.5, 3 years old. I stopped walking. I looked around in the automatic way you look around when you find something that shouldn't be there, as though the explanation might be visible in the middle distance. The trail was empty in both directions. The trees were quiet. There was no sound except the creek somewhere below and the very distant sound of a crow. I crouched down next to the shoe. Up close it looked new. Not new from the box new, but not weathered either. The blue fabric was clean. There was no mud on the sole, which struck me as odd since the trail had been muddy the previous week and I would have expected anything that had been sitting here more than a few days to show it. I picked it up. It was light the way an empty shoe is light, but it wasn't empty. There was moisture inside, a kind of deep permeating dampness that had nothing to do with rain or dew, and the smell that came off it when I turned it over was dark and cold and mineral, like the inside of a well, like the undersides of river stones, like somewhere deep below ground. I told myself it was lake water. I told myself a family had been hiking and a toddler had lost a shoe and the parents hadn't noticed or hadn't been able to retrieve it. I told myself all the reasonable things. I carried it out with me. I put it in my truck and drove to the sheriff's substation in Elwood, which was on Main Street between a hardware store and a diner, and which was staffed that afternoon by a deputy named Jim Varela, mid-40s, thick through the chest, the kind of cop who gives the impression of someone who has decided long ago what kind of town this is and what happens in it and is not particularly interested in having that assessment challenged. I explained where I'd found it. I explained that I was worried a child might be missing, that the shoe looked relatively new, that there was no corresponding boot or hiker who might have dropped it. Deputy Varela listened to all of this with the expression of a man who is waiting for you to finish so that he can think about something else. He took the shoe and put it in a clear Ziploc bag and wrote something on a tag and dropped the whole thing in a green plastic bin that said Found Items, Elwood SD. He told me he'd log it. He told me they'd look into it. He told me most lost items in the conservancy turned out to be nothing. He said, most, in a way that was clearly meant to close the conversation, not open it, and I drove home feeling vaguely foolish, the way you feel when you report something that everyone around you has already decided is not a problem. I made dinner. Pasta with olive oil and garlic and the last of a can of white beans. I ate at the table by the front window and watched the light go gold through the fir trees. I thought about the shoe twice, the way you think about things you've already resolved, and then I didn't think about it again. I found it the next morning at 7:42. I know the exact time because I just checked my phone for messages before opening the front door, and the timestamp is there in my activity log. I opened the door to get the small stack of mail I'd seen the carrier leave the day before. I had a slot, but packages went on the doorstep, and there it was. On the welcome mat. The blue stride right sneaker. Left foot. Size 7 or 8. Perfectly upright, Velcro strap fastened, the way you'd set a shoe down if you were being careful about it. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. The morning was gray and cold, the gravel road empty, the trees dripping from the overnight moisture. There was no car in the driveway. There was no one visible in any direction. I looked at the shoe. I had the very strong sensation that it had been sitting there for a while, waiting, not in the way inanimate objects wait but in some other way I don't have good language for. I picked it up. The dampness was still there. Not worse, not better. The same cold mineral smell. I thought immediately of the deputy, of whether he could have driven out here as some kind of joke, which was so obviously absurd that I dropped the thought before I'd fully formed it. I thought of teenagers, of some local prank I wasn't aware of some chain of events that would make perfect sense once I understood the mechanism. I put the shoe on my passenger seat and drove back to the substation. Deputy Varela was not there. A younger officer named Torres was, small and sharp-featured, who listened to my story with a slightly different expression than Varela's, less dismissive, more carefully neutral, the expression of someone who has been trained to appear helpful. She walked me back to the evidence room, which was a locked closet off the main office, and she showed me the green bin. She lifted out the Ziploc bag. The tag was still on it. The bag was still sealed. Inside was the blue sneaker. Left foot. I looked at the sneaker in the bag. I looked at the sneaker I'd carried in from my truck. Officer Torres looked at both of them. She said, quietly, "Huh." She said she'd need to make a report. She said she'd need to note this. I said yes, please do that, and I drove home. The second shoe was on my dining room table. I hadn't left any windows open. The back door was locked. I checked the deadbolt, and it was engaged, and the key was on the hook by the stove where I always left it. The front door had been locked when I left. I know because I have a Ring doorbell with a deadbolt sensor, and the app shows the door lock status with timestamps, and the door had been locked from the time I left to the time I got back. The shoe was sitting on the table as though I'd put it there. Right foot, this time. The pair was now complete. The right shoe smelled the same as the left. Same cold, dark, underground water smell that I still couldn't stop thinking of as the smell of the inside of a well. I sat down in the dining room chair across from the shoe and looked at it for a while. I called my sister. I didn't tell her about the shoe. I asked her how the kids were doing and she talked for 20 minutes about my nephew's soccer league and my niece's science fair project, and I listened to every word of it and felt, very precisely, the particular gratitude of having evidence that the ordinary world was still out there and that I was still capable of accessing it. That night I checked every window and door twice. I set the Ring camera notifications to alert me for any motion at either the front or the back door. I put both shoes in a paper shopping bag, tied the handles together, put the bag in the hall closet, and closed the closet door. I went to bed at 10:30. I lay awake until at least 1 in the morning listening to the sounds of the house settling, the very faint sound of wind in the fir trees, the intermittent tick of the electric baseboard heaters. At some point I fell asleep. The sound woke me at 3:11. I know the time because I looked at my phone the instant I was conscious, a reflex from years of having a phone as an alarm clock. The sound was quiet. That's the thing I want to be clear about. It wasn't a bang or a crash or any of the sounds that horror movies have trained you to expect. It was small. Rhythmic. The softest possible sound of something damp contacting a hard floor. Lap. 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 Not quite dripping. Not quite footsteps. Something in between, the sound of something wet and small moving across a surface. I lay very still for what I think was about 30 seconds. The sound was coming from the direction of the living room. I told myself it was a pipe. I told myself it was the house. I picked up my phone, turned on the flashlight, got out of bed, and walked down the hallway. The living room was empty. The closet door was still closed. The front door was closed. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. I stood in the living room doorway with my phone flashlight making a hard white circle on the floor, and then I angled the light down, and I saw them. Footprints. Small ones. The size a toddler would make, the kind of prints you get when a child's wet feet walk across a dry floor, faint, already beginning to evaporate at the edges, but visible in the beam of the flashlight in the way that wet marks are visible on a matte surface. They started at the front door. They crossed the living room at a slight angle. They went down the hallway. They stopped at the threshold of my bedroom. At the exact place where my feet would be when I was lying in bed. I crouched down and looked at them for a long time without touching anything. They were not shoe prints. They were barefoot prints, small and complete, heel and ball and 5 little toe marks, each one pressed clearly into the laminate. I went back to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning I checked the Ring footage. There is a camera at the front door and one at the back, and both are motion activated, and both have night vision, and the footage from the previous 3 weeks is stored in the cloud. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and went through the footage for the previous night. At 3:08, 3 minutes before I woke up, the front door camera triggered a motion alert. The footage showed the door. The door was closed. The deadbolt indicator light was red, meaning locked. And then it turned green. And the door opened. Not quickly. Slowly, the way you open a door when you're being careful about noise. The camera showed the open door and the porch beyond it and the dark gravel driveway and the trees, and nothing else. No one coming through the door. Nothing visible entering. And then the door closed again, slowly, the same careful way. The deadbolt light went red. Total elapsed time, 47 seconds. At 3:09, the back door camera activated, but the footage was white noise. Not corrupted exactly, it played at the right speed, the timestamp increment normally, but the image was nothing but static, a gray fizzing blankness that lasted for 11 minutes and 3 seconds and then resolved abruptly into a clear image of my back porch, empty, in the gray pre-dawn light. I called Officer Torres. She came out that afternoon and looked at the footage and wrote things in her notebook and did not say very much. She looked at the footprints, which were still faintly visible if you got the light right. She looked in the hallway closet. The bag was still there. The shoes were still inside. Both of them. She said she would flag the shoe report from the Conservancy to the search and rescue coordinator and ask if there had been any missing persons in the area involving a young child. She said she'd have someone look at the camera footage technically. She said if I felt unsafe I should consider staying somewhere else for a few nights, said it in a way that was professional and appropriate and that told me absolutely nothing about what she actually thought. I thanked her and she drove away and I stood in the driveway for a while watching the dust from her cruiser settle back onto the gravel road. I'm not going to pretend I was rational for the next 48 hours. I moved through the house like a man navigating a space that has subtly changed its geometry, everything in the right place, everything looking the same, but with the constant low-level wrongness of a dream where a room is simultaneously your childhood kitchen and somewhere you've never been. I worked badly. I ate without tasting anything. I called my sister twice and talked about nothing. I ordered a second camera system from Amazon, a set of 4 Wise cameras to supplement the Ring, and I set them up inside the house, one in the living room pointed at the front door, one in the kitchen, one in the hallway. I moved the shoes from the closet to the dining table because I wanted them where I could see them. I don't know why that seemed better. It didn't seem better for very long. On the morning of March 22, a Friday, I called my friend Pete Okafor in Portland, who teaches high school physics and is the most practically intelligent person I know, and I told him everything. Pete listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities, and when I was done he said, "Can you leave for a few days?" I said yes. He said, "Then leave." I packed a bag that afternoon. I took my laptop and my chargers and 4 days of clothes and I drove north on Route 58, then west on 126, and stopped at a Comfort Inn just outside the town of Junction City, which was about 50 miles from Elwood and which I had picked essentially at random. The room was on the second floor. It smelled like synthetic lavender and old carpet. The parking lot had a gas station and a subway and a feeling of complete anonymity that I found, at first, enormously comforting. I ordered delivery Thai food and ate it on the bed watching a nature documentary about octopuses. I took a long shower. I felt, for the first time in 4 days, like something approaching my normal self. I thought, maybe it was all connected to the specific awfulness of that house, the isolation, the divorce hangover, the way the mind can manufacture menace out of coincidence when it's stressed and alone. I thought, I'll take the weekend, maybe call the property manager about ending the rental early, find somewhere less remote for the spring. I thought all of these reasonable things and then I opened my suitcase to get a change of clothes and I saw them. They were inside the suitcase, nestled between a rolled-up sweater and my DOP kit, positioned with a deliberateness that was somehow worse than if they'd just been thrown in. The left shoe. The right shoe. Sitting upright, their Velcro straps neatly fastened, as though someone had packed them carefully and intentionally. The suitcase had been packed in my bedroom closet with my own hands. I was alone in the house when I packed it. I had driven directly here. I had not stopped. They were filled, this time. Not with a foot, not with crumpled paper, filled with dark soil, the kind of heavy wet soil that comes from somewhere deep, and worked into the soil, barely visible until I tilted the first shoe into the bathroom light, were small bones. Rodent bones, I think. Small curved ribs, fine as hairs. The phalanges of something tiny and once living. The cold wet smell was stronger than it had ever been. I sat on the edge of the hotel bathtub and held one of the shoes, and the bones shifted inside it, and I put it back in the suitcase and closed the suitcase and sat in the desk chair and looked at the wall for what might have been 2 hours. My phone buzzed. A notification from the Ring app, motion at my front door. I'd left the cameras running at the house, set to notify me of anything. I opened the app. The notification was from the indoor camera I'd placed in the living room, the one pointed at the front door. The timestamp was 9:47 p.m. I tapped through to the footage. The living room was dark. I'd left the lights off. The camera's night vision rendered everything in that flat gray-green that makes familiar spaces look alien. The couch. The coffee table. The rug. The window. And in the center of the frame, on the floor in front of the couch, someone was sitting. Small. Sitting with their back to the camera, legs crossed, the way a young child sits on the floor when they're playing with something. The figure was indistinct, either the night vision resolution or something else making the edges soft and uncertain, but the shape was clearly a child. Maybe 2.5, 3 feet tall. Dark hair. Pale skin, very pale, the kind of pale that red is almost white in the night vision. They were doing something with their hands, a repetitive motion, striking the floor in front of them with one small fist. Steadily. Rhythmically. I turned up the volume on my phone and I could hear it, very faint through the microphone, the sound of knuckles on laminate, and it took me almost a full minute to realize what it reminded me of. It reminded me of a heartbeat. My heartbeat. The specific rhythm of it, the particular cadence that I knew from lying awake in the dark with my pulse in my ears. It matched it exactly. It maintained it exactly. I watched the footage for 4 minutes and 20 seconds until the camera timed out and the recording ended and the living room sat empty on my screen, and the figure was gone, and there was no one there, and the floor was bare. I drove back to Elwood the next morning. I want to say I had a plan, but that would be overstating it. I had an object, the fireplace in the living room. It was a wood-burning insert, solid cast iron, and it threw good heat, and I had been using it regularly since I moved in. I took the shoes from the suitcase and I put them on the passenger seat and I drove in silence, and when I got to the house I went inside without looking at anything I didn't need to look at, and I brought the shoes to the fireplace and I put them in. Both of them. I built a fire around them with the newspaper and kindling I kept in a copper bucket beside the hearth, and I lit it, and I watched the flame catch the paper and climb toward the shoes, and then something happened that I have been trying to find a rational explanation for ever since. The fire did not take. Not slowly, instantly. The paper burned, the kindling caught, and then the flame reached the shoes and snuffed out. Completely. Not guttered, not reduced, extinguished, as if something had pressed a hand over it. The room went very slightly colder. I noticed it immediately, a drop of temperature that was distinct from the absence of the fire, as though the cold had its own source. I knelt in front of the fireplace and struck another match and tried again. Paper. Kindling. The shoes, sitting unmarked in the center of the grate, not burning, not smelling of heat, looking exactly as they always looked. The second fire went out the same way. I was reaching for a third match when I heard the sound from the chimney. Not the sound of wind. Not the sound of a bird or debris. A sound like water, like a large quantity of cold water moving through a confined space, and then from the fireplace opening, not smoke, not ash, not the normal byproducts of a hearth, water. Black water, very cold, welling up over the edge of the grate and spreading across the hearthstone and running in slow black fingers across the floor toward my knees. I scrambled backward and hit my heel on the coffee table and the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a brownout. Gone, instantly, the way lights go when a breaker trips, except that the breaker box is in the mudroom and I hadn't touched it. The room was dark. The water was still coming. I could hear it in the darkness, the soft persistent spread of it across the floor, and I could feel the cold of it even from where I'd backed up against the coffee table. I fumbled for my phone. My hands were doing something I needed to consciously override, a fine trembling that made the phone hard to hold, and I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the fireplace. The shoes were gone. The grate was empty. The black water was still spreading, dark and very thin, across the hearthstone and the floor, and it smelled of the Conservancy creek and underground stone and cold deep places, and I was about to stand, was putting my weight on my hands to push myself up from the floor, when I felt it. Something closed around my right ankle. Very small. Two small hands, fingers finding the bone of my ankle with a precision that suggested familiarity, suggested practice, and the temperature of those hands was the temperature of the black water, of the creek drainage, of deep below the ground. I aimed the flashlight down. I couldn't breathe. The light fell on my feet, on my socks, on the floor around my feet, and on my feet were the shoes. The blue stride-right sneakers. On my feet. Where my socks were a moment before, there were now the shoes, laced tight. They had laces now, I noticed, not Velcro, laces I could not recall seeing before, and they were already tied, double knotted, and they were tightening. That is the only word that is accurate. Tightening. As though contracting, as though the material were shrinking, the sides pressing inward against the bones of my feet with a progressive, systematic, interested pressure that was immediately painful and within 30 seconds was producing a sensation that I can only describe as my own bones becoming uncertain of themselves. I felt, a sound from the direction of the bedroom hallway. A very slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards. And in the gap between the hallway floor and the bedroom door, I'd left the door ajar, a pale hand appeared. Small. Child-sized. Moving with the careful slowness of something that is not in a hurry. The fingers curled around the edge of the door. Long for a hand that size. Very pale. In the hand, trailing across the floor, were 2 lengths of shoelace. And then, from behind the door, barely loud enough to register over the pressure in my feet and the sound of my own heartbeat and the soft continued sound of the black water spreading across my living room floor, a voice. Small. Patient. Pleased. Your turn to try them on. I don't know what happened after that. I know I'm writing this. I know I'm not in Elwood anymore. I know that both of my feet are still here, though they don't feel entirely like mine when I walk on them, and in the morning sometimes I find small damp footprints on the floor beside my bed that are not the right size for my feet. I know that I've called Officer Torres twice since leaving and reached her voicemail both times. I know that the Ring app still occasionally notifies me of motion at the Elwood house, even though I returned the keys to the property manager and I am not there anymore and neither is anyone I know. I know that last Tuesday, when I opened the app to delete it from my phone, the indoor living room camera was showing the room as I left it, furniture, rug, the dark hearthstone, the copper kindling bucket. Empty. And then, in the corner of the frame, almost out of range of the camera's field of view, there was a small blue shape that I looked at for a long time before I understood what I was seeing. One shoe. Just the one. Sitting upright. Waiting. And I put my phone face down on the table and I have not opened that app since. My feet hurt a little today. They hurt most days now. Not badly. Just a low, persistent pressure, like something is being slowly, carefully, measured.